We set sail on an inward voyage, gently guided by Alan Watts's profound wisdom, to unearth the core of our being and savor the splendor of the present moment. Welcome, traveler. You've traversed vast distances in your quest for meaning, peace, and comprehension. In the dance of life, we often find ourselves caught in the pursuit of futures that never arrive and memories that are but echoes of the past. Alan Watts reminded us, the only way to make sense out of change is to plunge into it, move with it, and join the dance. Consider this moment, traveler, not the seconds ticking by, but this very instance of existence. It is here, in the presence of the present, that life unfolds in its most vivid hues. Watts taught us to embrace the eternal now, for it is all we truly have. As you breathe in this moment, ask yourself, what are the joys that I overlook in my search for happiness elsewhere? Watts believed in the art of living harmoniously with the world, not as separate entities battling against it, but as integral parts of a greater whole. In the silent whispers of the cosmos, we find a profound truth, that we are not just in the universe, but the universe is in us. We are made of the very stars that light up the night sky. Reflect on this interconnectedness and let it guide your steps on this journey of self-discovery. Muddy water is best cleared by leaving it alone. This analogy teaches us the power of non-interference, of allowing life to settle and clarify on its own. Can you recall a time when stepping back allowed a situation to improve naturally? Contemplate the strength found in patience and the wisdom in surrender. In the stillness, listen. What does the voice within you say? Watts encouraged us to listen deeply, not just to the world around us, but to the silent language of our own being. In understanding ourselves, we begin to understand the universe. Consider how change has recently unfolded in your life. Watts teaches us, the only way to make sense out of change is to plunge into it, move with it, and join the dance. It's a reminder that change is not our enemy, but a partner in the dance of life, inviting us to move with grace and adaptability. To have faith is to trust yourself to the water. When you swim, you don't grab hold of the water, because if you do, you will sink and drown. Instead, you relax and float. Such wisdom encourages us to embrace faith as a form of surrender, trusting that the currents of life will carry us where we need to go. Letting go and floating in the embrace of the universe allows us to navigate life's changes with grace. In every breath, there's a universe of possibilities. You didn't come into this world. You came out of it, like a wave from the ocean. You are not a stranger here. This perspective invites us to see ourselves as organic to this world, not as outsiders, but as inherent expressions of nature's creativity. Your existence is as natural and significant as the mountains, the skies, and the oceans. Alan Watts once reminded us, we cannot live pleasantly without living wisely and nobly and righteously. It's a call to embrace wisdom, nobility, and righteousness in our lives, not merely as ideals, but as practical approaches to everyday living. Your journey is not just about seeking joy, but about finding it through living with purpose and integrity. This is the real secret of life, to be completely engaged with what you are doing in the here and now. And instead of calling it work, realize it is play. Imagine approaching each day with the spirit of playfulness, transforming routine tasks into moments of joy and discovery. This perspective can revolutionize the way we perceive our daily lives, making every moment an opportunity for engagement and wonder. Trying to define yourself is like trying to bite your own teeth. Reflection on this statement encourages us to embrace the mystery of our being without the need for rigid definitions. Our essence cannot be fully captured in words or concepts. It's something to be experienced, a journey of continuous discovery and wonder. The only Zen you find on the tops of mountains is the Zen you bring up there. True understanding and peace come not from external achievements, but from what we cultivate within. Ask yourself, what Zen are you bringing into your daily climb? In connecting with the world, we find our true selves. Man suffers only because he takes seriously what the gods made for fun. Acknowledge the playful nature of existence, seeing the lighter side of life, even in its challenges. This doesn't diminish the realness of our struggles, but offers a perspective that brings lightness to our hearts. You are not a drop in the ocean. You are the entire ocean in a drop. This thought invites us to dissolve the illusion of separateness, to recognize our profound interconnectedness with all existence. How does this shift in perspective alter your understanding of self and others? Feel the liberating truth that you embody the whole universe's majesty and mystery. Exploring the depths of self-discovery, we encounter a powerful thought. The more you know yourself, the more clarity there is. Self-knowledge has no end. You don't come to an achievement. You don't come to a conclusion. It is an endless river. As you navigate this endless river of self-knowledge, what surprising currents have you discovered within yourself? Reflect on the journey, not as a path to a final destination, but as an ongoing exploration. Alan Watts offers a simple yet profound insight. If you are depressed, you are living in the past. If you are anxious, you are living in the future. If you are at peace, you are living in the present. Consider this moment. How often do you anchor yourself in the now to find peace? Let this reflection guide you toward embracing the present as a sanctuary of tranquility. Alan Watts remarked, "Death is not the opposite of life, but a part of it." By acknowledging death as an integral aspect of life, we can live more fully, appreciating each moment's preciousness. How does accepting the impermanence of life influence the way you live and cherish each day? In contemplating control, we're inspired by Watts's observation. The more you try to control something, the more it controls you. Free yourself and let things take their own natural course. Where in your life have you felt the tight grip of control? And how might releasing it transform your experience? Reflect on the freedom that comes with letting go and trusting life's flow. Let's delve into the unity of opposites, a theme central to Watts's philosophy. You cannot have up without down, or down without up. This principle reminds us that life's dualities are interconnected and essential to the whole. How does embracing this concept of unity in duality shift your perspective on challenges and conflicts? Watts teaches us, life is a beautiful play of opposites, a dance between light and shadow. Observe the interplay of light and darkness in your own life. How do these contrasts create depth, richness, and meaning in your experience? Consider the ebb and flow of the tides, a perfect metaphor for the rhythm of life. You cannot have the crest without the trough of the wave, Watts reminds us. Embrace this moment, feeling the full spectrum of emotions that flow through you, recognizing that each has its place in the tapestry of your existence. Now, turn your attention to the concept of stillness and motion. Watts illustrates, true stillness is not the absence of movement, but a balanced movement. As you breathe deeply, feel yourself at the center of this balance, the point of calm within the storm of daily life. Embrace the art of listening with the heart, as Watts elucidates. The art of listening is to be silent as to hear what the other person is not saying. In your conversations and interactions, how often do you truly listen, not just to words, but to the silence between them? Reflect on the depth of connection and understanding that arises from true listening. Traveler, as our journey today nears its end, remember that the path to enlightenment is not about reaching a destination, but embracing the journey itself. Let the teachings of Alan Watts illuminate your path, not as a map, but as a lantern, guiding you through the beauty of existence, one mindful step at a time. Thank you for joining me in this reflection. May your travels be light and your spirit at peace.